Session 3 and 4 taught by Dr. Reams and Black in 1977. This is tape 29 side A.
The last tape of this session. This is tape number 29-6/27/7/1-77, class number 3 and 4, 4 p.m., July the 1st, 1977, of Dr. Reams' Biological Theory of Ionization. Sandy Badeau reviews nutrition, minerals, foods, and so forth.
Okay, now, yes. Damage by exhaust fumes?
Damage by exhaust fumes is a lack of oxygen.
Okay, now we are talking about another phase here of cause and effect in our food relationships. Let me ask you this question. How many of you have ever had brittle fingernails? In your patients and yourself, do you know what that is a lack of? Okay, phosphates. Now, pardon? You'd certainly have to get the phosphate into the system to correct it, wouldn't you? Okay. Now, where is the phosphate stored in food, in our food items that we take in? Sugar. Right. Okay. Anything that has sugar has phosphate. This is hard to swallow when you're used to saying, cut out the sugar in your diet. You've got too much sugar, you see. But yet we're not talking about it from that standpoint. So you got to reverse, at least myself, I have to reverse my thinking about what we're talking about in our definitions of sugars. Now, what are we talking about in our definitions of sugars? Okay, all your carbohydrates, aren't you, put together in a natural state. Right.
Not necessarily, no. Because you may be a diabetic, and therefore you have to go by the numbers. But the way to rebuild fingernails is to take Mencol. I've never seen it fail to rebuild fingernails.
Go by the numbers. Now, pardon? Mencol? We're not talking about white sugar. That's why I said I had to reverse my thinking. See, I said, well, the minute you see sugar, what's a dentist think about? White sugar, brown sugar. Instead of the natural form out of the plant before it's processed, in the sugar cane itself, for that matter. Yeah. Okay, what is the problem with a high or a low sugar? What is the actual problem? Okay, it's lack of oxygen, isn't it? But what about a right sugar? What is the importance of sugar in the system? Okay, it actually transfers oxygen, it holds oxygen. But high or low, then you build up oxygen debt. Okay, now, if we look at a plant, and let's go briefly to find out how where the phosphate gets into the plant sugar. Where does the oxygen come from in a plant? Water, okay. Oxygen comes from the water. Now, Doc drew out for us last night. I'm not going to attempt to draw it, but he drew out a molecule of water, several of them together, and then he talked about the effects of light energy upon that in a simplistic way. Now, he says it's more complicated than this, but this is a simplistic way in which the phosphate is bound, yet it's a catalyst. Yes. Well, he was talking about fixing carbons in there with the catalyst as a phosphate to make the sugar. Is this right? Yeah, right. It was water first and the phosphate. Okay. And the light hitting the water acted like opening it up to allow the phosphate to carry in and distribute the carbons within that molecule. When the weather cooled down at night. Right. Okay. Phosphate slipped out. Remember a catalyst? So we have the sunlight hitting the water, expanding it, the phosphate carrying the carbon in. As night comes along, cools down, the phosphate slips out and leaves the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen as a sugar. He says the ionization picks up even if it doesn't cool down. Now, Doc also came along with the term chelate. Now, what does that mean? Pardon? That means a claw, doesn't it? Binds. Now, how do you define sugar as a chelate? Well, what does it do? Why is sugar a chelate then, if we're talking about it? Okay, it becomes a binder for oxygen transfer. Isn't this correct? Okay. You see, it becomes a binder. The chelate, meaning claw in the Greek, grabs onto it to hold it as a transfer basis. And in our system then, this is where, again, why the sugar is important for a transfer mechanism. And he calls it a chelate. Now, he also gave us an illustration of the corn silk, which some of you may have heard before, may not. I hadn't heard it before. But he talks about how plants, remember he said the higher the mineral, the higher the sugar content? Okay. In a corn silk, for example, when the corn is ripening, what is given off at the end of the silk? No, what is it? There's a sort of a residue on the silk as it's forming. What is it? On the silk. It's sticky. What is it? Sugars, yeah. Okay. Right, sweet corn. So he says that when these sugars come out, they come in contact with the oxygen. The oxygen is brought out, comes in contact with the hydrogen, and forms alcohol. And the moth comes along, lays its egg on the silk, and he says when it eats the sugar, or the sugar alcohol, gets drunk and falls on the ground. Sounds simple, doesn't it? That's what he says. That's a rule. You have to remember that. Dry silk corn has worms. Now, I haven't grown enough corn to know this, but I'm intrigued with it. I'd like to be able to try it if I had a good place to grow corn. Okay. Yes, you say you don't have any worms in your corn? You got is it a sticky silk? She has enough phosphate in the soil then. Okay. Now, he says animals now, of course, when we're talking going from plant to animals, we're talking about the addition of nitrogen. Now, in the equation of cause and effect relationship of foods that we're talking about, he referred to the fact that in the range of 1 to 2, that we have our ideal sugar balance, where we get our ideal oxygen transfer. Now, this struck a chord with me because recently, in reading some medical research, we have always been led to believe that if the brain goes without oxygen for how long, you're done. How long does it have to go? 4 minutes, all right? Now, there's some people doing research on this that, for some reason, didn't believe this when they saw people who had been comatose for 35 and 40 minutes and brought out of that and without absolutely any brain damage. And in doing the research on that, they're finding now that what's important is not the fact that the oxygen can't get to the brain, but the brain metabolism centered around sugar at the time. If you have a proper sugar levels in the system, your brain will survive quite a while without oxygen. These people who are partying and indulging and carrying on, and all of a sudden they get exposed to a drowning situation, their possibility of surviving past 3 to 4 minutes is really low. And at those people who have good balance of sugars within their system, their possibility of surviving goes way beyond that. And I thought this was tremendously interesting how it related to what you were talking about here. He also says that an individual's weight loss will drop to normal with this proper balance in the system. Genetic programmed weight will be obtained if this sugar balance is maintained. Now, one more thing along this sugar line. He came towards the end of what we were talking about on these two subjects. And he says that, of course, I'm familiar with this and giving individuals glucose tolerance tests. The accepted ranges for normal blood sugars are around anywhere from 75 to 90. And the problem is when you test people the way Doc's doing it, you begin to find out that these people can be diabetics or have carbohydrate metabolism imbalances even at this range, which doing normal blood sugar testing does really not show you. And so this will be brought out in numbers more than blood sugar. And this was impressed upon me, the value of this system, when I first came across this. That healing will not take place without enough oxygen. It's not because the blood sugar is too high. This is something that is really not clarified in many medical texts. The lack of oxygen is our healing. And so people will rub vitamin E and they'll do everything else on the sores and cuts, And some people it may help, and other people it won't. Now, he also brought up the fact that the vitamin C is, again, getting back to vitamin C, and I'm saying I want you to understand that if this seems disorganized, I'm trying to take these statements and put them together as well as I know how after listening to Doc. So I'm actually trying to be his interpreter, and then he can add and subtract wherever I misinterpret. But he brings out the fact that vitamin C comes into play in knitting the cells together if, get this now, if there is a nerve producing a stole in that area on which the coating then of the stole can be plated to produce the basis for cell structure. Okay, you remember, you go back to the 4 stages we talked about. And what did we have in the 4 stages? What was the first stage? The triad, right? And what was the catalyst in that triad? Then what happened in the second stage? You had water and blood. And then in the third stage, you had a heat factor take place in there, the catalyst, and then you had the bone formation. But the stole comes into play in here as the outcropping of the programmed nerve extension from the brain. And this stole, pardon? Right. In stage 1, this stole during this process now starts this plating of this triad, bringing the minerals together. And that the vitamin C in here, of course, is the coating that is important in this plating process. In other words, it binds the proteins, which are the electrolytes, transferring this in there. Coating. Yeah, a coating. C-O-A-T-I-N-G, right. Vitamin C plays a part in this mechanism of the plating as it becomes the binder for the protein. See, as the proteins are electrolytes transferring the minerals in that you're looking for in the plating process. Yes?
Is this the sole reason?
Yes.
Okay. If there's a healing of the central nervous system, this is the reason. Lesion of the central nervous system, there is no healing. Okay. Yes? In other words, where does the programming for cell development come from? All right, if you have a certain part of the brain damaged by a lesion, then it will not be programmed down.
Except that the brain will eventually...
Okay. Yeah.
By Vegas in the last...
Right.
Okay, did you all hear that? Okay, that Doc refers to the vagus as the central nervous system.
You finished? Thank you very, very much. Of the action of what we have talked about in the formation of a cell. And now then we have 2 questions, I imagine. Just 2 about this. How do these cells join to make the heart different from the brain, and the brain different from the bones, and the liver, and the lungs, and so forth? In this next course, we take up the chain reaction. Formulation of the sperm and the ovary, how they're made, how they're put together, how they start, how they grow. And in this course, we've already told you much of the things that's necessary for to take place. But first, you've got to learn the chain reaction, or you won't understand the next course. Now, one question I would like to ask you, sincerely, and most of you are going to be unprepared to answer this today, even though you think you are answering it correctly. Do you sincerely feel that it's too heavy to take 2 courses together? I'll let you show our hands in a moment. The 2 courses together at the same time. The ones that feels like it is, hold up your hands, that they should be separated. Okay. Now, I'll tell you what. When you go out and start to use this, I think you're going to change your mind. Okay? I didn't ask that. I just asked how many thought there was too much for one course, and nobody's hands went up. So I assumed that all the rest were on the other side.
Partly depends on how soon the next course comes up.
Well, the point is now, the fifth course comes up in about the end of this month. End of August, yes. Well, the end of August. Now, unless you have thoroughly mastered logarithms, and you have thoroughly mastered this, I would advise you to wait until you do get it to where it's working smoothly before you attack the next. If you don't, you're going to have a lot of knowledge that you might make a wonderful teacher, but it wouldn't be worth 2 cents to you when you start to use it. Yes.
Doc, you asked us a question to us.
Yes.
Perhaps you made a statement that heavy into the system through our spheres.
Yes.
Would you please give them?
He said that some of the heavy metals come into the bottom through the music of the spheres. The music of the spheres is a term that's come in since radio has come in, sending its anionic beams out from the station to the radios and to the television sets. Well, a lot of those bounce onto heavy metals, and it's in the air, in the sunlight especially, and even in the night. There's some of them that are lifted up by the ionization from the earth, and they are bounced into your system by the lost ion that gets channeled off of the narrow path from the television station to the television set. So this has been called the music of the spheres, because in the air there's a lot of music going on right now, but you can't hear it. There's pictures in the air, but you can't see them. So this is what it's talking about. Yes.
I think 60 minutes it caused cataract.
I've heard that, but I have not been able to prove it. Cataracts is a mineral deficiency, not a microwave oven. Yes.
These minerals may be considered.
Some of them can be, yes. Or that depends on the form they're in. But they can only do damage, especially when there's a low energy rating and you do not do enough deep breathing. For instance, if you get into a chemical plant and there's an odor that you're not familiar with, you'll catch yourself taking short breaths so that the odor won't stifle you. Have you ever tried to inhale this first time a cigarette, how strangled you got? Well, this is what I'm talking about, because the system rebels against drastic changes. But if you can breathe deeply enough and your energy is high enough, you can exist in an awful lot of smog without damage. But it's a good idea there's a rule in the Bible, tempt not the Lord thy God. And when I'm flying a plane, that's one thing I don't do, is I tempt not the Lord thy God. And it's a good idea in the smog, if you can get out of it, to get out of it. But if it's impossible to get out of it, then try to stay as healthy